Tonight we're going to move into the study of the Apostle Thomas. Now Thomas is best known in biblical history as the apostle who doubted that Jesus had risen from the grave. He said, "Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will not believe." So Thomas has become famous, although, of course, he later believed when he saw Jesus and placed his fingers in the nail marks. He's become known in biblical history as Doubting Thomas. But really, there's a whole lot more to Thomas than just this one time in his life. And we're going to, in part 1 and part 2 next time of Thomas, we're going to study some of the other things about him that maybe you've never heard before. The first thing is there was the Gospel of Thomas. Now, the Gospel of Thomas is not in the canon, and it's not in the canon because it's a whole lot different than the other 4 Gospels in the canon. It's basically what we call wisdom sayings. The story of Jesus Christ that we're used to from the 4 Gospels, his life, his birth, his life, his death, his resurrection, is not in the Gospel of Thomas. And so these so-called wisdom sayings that make up this book don't have the theology in it that we're used to in the 4 Gospels of the New Testament. Now, there are some biblical scholars that think the Gospel of Thomas is important, but the reason we Christians put very little stock in the Gospel of Thomas is because it talks about a different way of being saved than the 4 Gospels of the New Testament does. It goes against all we Christians have learned and believe from the Bible. In fact, best of my understanding, there's only one remaining Gospel of Thomas anywhere in the world. It's in a library in Egypt called Nag Hammadi Library. So let's look at this Gospel of Thomas and see what it was about it that kept the church fathers from including it in the canon, and see what it was about it and what it presented as a picture of a different kind of way to be saved, so we'll understand why Christians don't put much stock in it. The Gospel of Thomas seems to go along with the Gnostic view. Remember, we've discussed the Gnostics before, and the Gnostic view was that you had to have a secret knowledge to be saved. However, this Gnostic view did not come into prominence until the 2nd century, almost 100 years after Jesus had been interpreted in the original Gospels as a first century Palestinian Jew who taught what we are so familiar with in the 4 Gospels. He didn't teach any secret truth or inner enlightenment to be saved. He taught faith in God and faith in Jesus Christ. So if you read the Gospel of Thomas closely, what you see is they pick bits and pieces out of the 4 Gospels and they reworked it to try to make it pleasing to the Gnostics. The picture of Jesus that is painted in the Gospel of Thomas bears almost no resemblance whatsoever to the carpenter from Galilee that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John talk about. So therefore, we can be sure that only the 4 biblical Gospels give us an accurate view, number 1, of Jesus Christ, but number 2, of true salvation. So, should we put any stock in the Gospel of Thomas? Not at all. It's a bunch of wisdom sayings to please the Gnostics, and it has no basis in fact whatsoever. Something else, however, we want to talk about with Thomas is, did Thomas go to India as an apostle, and did he start a Christian church in India? Well, let's look at that for a minute. The early Christian movement went both east and west out of Jerusalem. Now the part that went east moved into the countries of Persia, India, and China. And Christianity thrived in those countries for over 1,000 years. But then great persecution against Christianity came along, and it severely diminished the number of Christian churches in the eastern part of Asia. Only a small remnant of the many Christian churches that were once in Asia still exist. The most prominent one being the Assyrian church, which is sometimes called the Nestorian church. Now this Assyrian church is a true Christian church. It's not a Catholic church. It's not a church of the Eastern Orthodoxy. It's a distinct branch of the Christianity that came to the Far East in the 1st century BC after the apostles went out preaching. Who do we give credit for that? Well, a lot of people want to give it to Thomas. They want to say that he was the missionary who took the gospel to India. This has been something that's been discussed and talked about for hundreds of years. There's not a whole lot of proof that it wasn't him, but then again, there's not a whole lot of proof that it was. But church history seems to think that either it was Thomas or he had a lot to do with taking the gospel to the Far East, especially to India. Now, there's been a book written about that's kind of wild. And they don't put a whole lot of stock in the book itself. It's called The Acts of Thomas. It's full of all kind of legends and questionable theological doctrine. But because it presented a story of one of the original 12 apostles, and it made him look like such a wonderful missionary, a lot of Christians in that day thought a whole lot of it. But the stories that are in this Acts of Thomas are so wild. I'm not going to go into them. I'm sure you could find information on them on the internet or in a library. The stories that are in this Acts of Thomas are so wild that few Christians put any stock in it. But it is thought that Thomas either went to India himself as a missionary or he played a big role in getting missionaries there. So we'll give Thomas credit for helping to spread the gospel into India. The place that we are more confident that Thomas went to was a city in modern-day Turkey, the country of Turkey, known as Edessa. There's a lot of evidence, pure hard fact, that Thomas did go to Edessa and preach the gospel there. Now, one of the reasons we think it's very probable that he went to Edessa is Edessa wasn't far from Antioch. And Antioch was one of the places that many of the apostles gathered down through the years as they preached the gospel. It was kind of a home base for them. And you could go down a good Roman road and get to Antioch and then to Edessa from the Holy Land, and it wouldn't take you, extremely long time, at least in that day. So Thomas could very well have gone and preached as a missionary in Edessa just as easily as many other Christians and other apostles went there. Therefore, we think that the history that the people of Edessa have of an apostolistic visit by the Apostle Thomas has a good chance of being true. Now, if you want to know where this area is that Thomas was probably doing a lot of his preaching in, for sure, it lies today within the national borders of 4 or 5 countries. Those countries are Syria, Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan, which is, of course, east of Jerusalem, east of Israel. And this is where we have more evidence than any other that Thomas did a great deal of his missionary preaching. It's believed all across those 5 countries that Thomas established or helped establish a huge Christian church there. And it's believed that he had 2 of the original 12 apostles helping him. And they were Thaddeus and Bartholomew. So it is a lot of evidence that Thomas, Thaddeus, and Bartholomew were missionaries in that area of Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Syria, and Turkey. One of the ways they have come to this conclusion is there's been a lot of information written about them being there down through the years, and they found a lot of archaeological records that connected Thomas, Thaddeus, and Bartholomew to the lands east of Jerusalem, not all the way to Asia. We have some evidence of that, but mainly to that Middle Eastern area just east of Jerusalem. So the claim that Thomas took the Christian message east of Jerusalem seems to be true. It just seems like he maybe didn't go as far east as some people think he did. So that leaves a question as we finish up this introductory lesson about Thomas. How far did he really go to the east? Was it just the Middle Eastern area of those 5 countries we just mentioned? Or did he actually take it into China and India and further on? Maybe even Japan? Well, that's a question we'll take up in part 2. But we do know for sure that Thomas's life was a whole lot more than just about being doubting Thomas. We know that he did a lot of preaching of the gospel, that he led a lot of people to Jesus Christ. And what we're doing here is we're just trying to kind of pinpoint where he did that at. So in today's lesson, we discussed the fact that we're pretty much sure that he was in Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Turkey, and Syria. But was he any further east? There's not a whole lot of evidence of it so far. But we're going to bring to light next week a few more facts about it that I think you will find interesting. But the main thing I want to get across as we're doing this lesson is we need to remember Thomas for a whole lot more than just being doubting Thomas. Because he did a lot of good, he preached the gospel of Jesus Christ, and he led a lot of people to saving grace and knowledge of their Lord and Savior. I hope you've enjoyed this introductory lesson. We'll do part 2 of Thomas next week. And until then, I hope you have a good week. Stay safe, stay healthy. Hope to see you Sunday morning, 10:30, Raleigh Road Baptist Church as we celebrate the second Sunday of Advent. Thank you and good night.